I think people forget that Canada has its own things going on at the same time. The same year, actually, that Stonewall happened, Canada legalized or decriminalized homosexuality.
I didn't realize that,
Yeah.
actually. You're so right.
My name is Ash Thompson.
My name is Harper-Hugo.
My name is Brent.
Yes, my name is Michael Fair.
Mabuhay! My name is Melinda Verga.
We are Drag Out the Love, and you're watching Queer in Alberta.
Mwah.
Welcome back to another episode of Queer in Alberta, the podcast where we talk to 2S LGBTQIA+ Albertans from all across the province. I'm your host, Kels Valenzuela Delamarter. I use she, her pronouns, but you already know me, and I am so excited to introduce you to our guest today, all the way from Edmonton. We have today with us Harper-Hugo, who is the founder and head writer of Making Queer History, an online hub where they and their team run a series of articles and podcast episodes that work to tell the stories of the queer community's history. Their work has been featured in Bustle, Daily Extra, and has been mentioned in Vice, Slate, and Harper's Bazaar. They live with their wife and 3 cats in Edmonton. Harper-Hugo, how are you doing?
I'm having a great day, actually. So
great
I'm happy
day?
to be here.
I mean, you've got Hazel, Queer in Alberta's unofficial mascot, chilling
Yes.
beside you.
And she's being an absolute angel, has been an absolute angel.
I know.
Unproblematic queen.
Unproblematic queen through all of the trials and tribulations of set and etc. But I am so happy to have you in the space here in Lethbridge with me today. Thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And you were telling me before that this is not your first time in Lethbridge.
No.
You actually have a bit of a secret history with Lethbridge. Get into it.
Okay, yeah. I originally lived in Lethbridge from around 20, I don't know. I'm not going to say the exact years. I'm not certain. We moved back and forth a couple times. But we lived here when I was a teenager, really when I was figuring out that I was queer, honestly. And Lethbridge was such a huge part of that journey, actually.
We have that in common.
Exactly.
Right?
It's amazing. I've actually been so lucky to have found so many amazing queer people in Lethbridge. And really, when I had sort of all these self-discoveries, I had this amazing community who was just waiting and who was just right there, right out the door. And I had so many lovely experiences. The Pride of Lethbridge, the Pride Festival was my favorite Pride I've ever been to. It
Which
remains
tea?
that. Yes,
Tea.
yes. The Edmonton Pride situation sucks. It's really
I love
bad.
that. We're getting into it.
We're
First
getting into
5
it.
minutes of the podcast. You're like, this is how I feel
This is
about
how I feel.
Edmonton Pride.
Okay, do you want to hear something that okay, I'm just gonna say it. I'm just gonna say it.
Obviously.
Okay, so the first time I went to Edmonton Pride, we were just going around, and I was already there are too many corporations here. I hate it. And I'm trying to enjoy myself though. I'm trying to have a good time. And they're playing. The bank is playing all this music, and they start playing a Kanye West song, and I'm like, okay. I know this Kanye West song, and I know it has a slur in it, a slur against lesbians. And I'm like, okay, are they gonna? And they played it.
Just
they
full
played
on
the whole
at
slur on
Pride.
lesbian at Pride, and I was like, are you serious right now?
And this is where we think about allyship.
This is where we
think
think
about corporate spaces, pride spaces, but that's so interesting to hear.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, I feel like Lethbridge, it has its small community and the people here really love it.
Yeah.
But when you think about people in Edmonton or Calgary, it's they don't even think about Lethbridge Pride. So here you are in Edmonton being actually, it's kind of my favorite one.
And I definitely had a real adjustment period to Edmonton because I grew up in a small town. I grew up in Claire's home.
Hey, you're fully Southern Alberta diva.
Yeah, 100%. And I had such interesting experiences moving to Edmonton and just sort of realizing how disconnected some Edmontonians were from the realities of Southern Alberta.
How do you mean about that?
I remember I helped, or there was this trans kid who got into Camp Firefly.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a life-changing experience for them. It was the first time they were gendered correctly. They were from a Mormon family. They had this really difficult time growing up. And I was telling this to a friend. I was so excited for this kid that I helped, get there. And they just dismissed it. They're like, oh yeah, but Camp Firefly, I don't like the organizers. So, and I'm like,
okay.
Interesting. It sort of lets behind the scenes politics of who likes who get in the way of like the
Mm.
thing that really impacts people, which is like having community. And
Yes,
like
yes.
I think this person is annoying and I'm like, I don't care. Like I care
Mm.
about the fact that they got gendered correctly for the first time.
Which is the number one thing, right?
100%.
And I so see what you mean. I think it's like any kind of community, the bigger it gets or the
Mhm.
larger scale the event or operation, sometimes those like infighting
Yeah,
situations can happen, which is sad because then it dismisses this really beautiful experience that is the
exactly.
main point that brings
Exactly.
everybody together, right?
And like as much trash as I'll talk about Edmonton, because I will. That's
We're
what I'm
really
here
like
for.
starting off strong,
Yeah, we're starting
right?
off strong. I'm
Uh-huh.
representing Edmonton. I was really lucky because I worked at a camp for trans kids with the Pride Center
In
in
Edmonton.
Edmonton a
Yes.
couple years in a row. And a part of that was working with like other, not like old but older trans people. And I was like just chatting with them, having a good time. And I was talking to this one trans woman, and we were just talking about growing up in Alberta. And
Which typical. Queer people
typical.
meet each other. I'm like, so tell me your whole life story. Tell me your
Exactly. Tell me
trauma.
your trauma. And she was like, yeah, I grew up in Southern Alberta. I'm like, oh, I grew up in Southern Alberta, a really small town,
Mhm.
Claresholm. And she's like, I was there.
I'm actually your aunt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was actually there. Like, I knew where she worked. I knew the people she worked with. I knew all these amazing
Mhm.
things. And I was like, we're really connected. And it was just like such a beautiful experience because when I was in Claire's home, I felt like an alien. I felt like someone who did
Mm.
not belong there. I felt like someone who was alone in the universe.
Mm.
And there was a trans person across the street from me just living
I'm
her
getting chills. I'm getting
life.
chills hearing about that
It
because,
was
like,
beautiful.
right? And I just feel like so connected to you in those words. Like before we even get into anything with the podcast, because I
Mhm.
grew up in Bonnyville, like not too far
Oh,
from
yeah.
Edmonton. And same thing, like before I even knew that I was queer, I
Mhm.
very much felt exactly what you're describing. Like I
Mhm.
was an alien, didn't fit in,
Yeah.
really tried to conform and
Yeah.
unhappy.
Mhm.
And now it's the same thing where
Mhm.
moving away and all these years later, how many of my classmates have since come out as queer or moved to a
Yeah.
different city? Like, I don't know, I didn't expect to get into that today in
Yeah.
this like way to relate to one another. I think
Mhm.
it's really, really cool.
It's fantastic. And I just feel so lucky to know that there was like this whole queer story going on around me when I
Mm.
was silently struggling. Because, like, I think that's something that a lot of people, especially teenagers, don't know is that
Mm-hmm.
they like, you get really myopic when you're a teenager. You're thinking about yourself because your emotions are the first time you're feeling them and they're huge and it makes so much
Mm-hmm.
sense. But, like, there's trans women around you. There are beautiful, amazing queer people around you no matter where you are.
Yes. Yeah.
And they're experiencing the beauty of being queerness for the first time too. And like you are connected to that and you will never not be connected to that. What a beautiful thing.
I think we're doing the exact same work, just like different format, same
Yeah,
thing, different font. And I'm
exactly.
obsessed. Like, I'm so happy to connect with you. And
Oh,
I think
thank you.
this segues so beautifully
Hmm.
into making queer history. Like,
Thank you.
you're talking about finding all of these stories that are
Hmm.
around you and maybe not everybody sees. But
Hmm.
tell me a bit more for folks that are hearing about it for the first time.
Hmm.
What would you describe making queer history is?
Making Queer History is a series of articles. We have a couple other things that go along with that, but the heart of the project is a series of articles where we talk about different stories from the history of queerness. And like usually
Mm-hmm.
that focuses on a person, but sometimes it's a place, sometimes it's a thing, sometimes it's an event. But what really drew me in, like it made me passionate about it, was just the individual people
Mm.
and realizing how many ways there were to be queer and how many ways were forgotten of being queer. And we're so close, we can just touch it. And we
Mm-hmm.
just have to reach out. Because I think I see a lot, especially right now, and there seems to be an uptick in this, people being like, we weren't taught our history. We
Yes.
we weren't encouraged to learn it. And that's so true. But there were so many queer historians, there are so many queer people studying history who just are reaching out to you and you just have to put your hand out. They are
Mm-hmm.
there because when I first started researching, I was like, I'm the first person to ever think of doing this.
Groundbreaking.
I'm
It's
breaking.
me.
Exactly. But I have been so lucky to have discovered so many different people are here before me.
Mm-hmm.
So many different people are doing the same thing, had the same thought, had the same passion. And they made the way so much easier for me. And you just
Absolutely.
have to reach out.
No, I think it's so important. And like I want to ask you a little bit
Mhm.
about even before it became what it is today,
Yeah.
making queer history. How did it start for you though? Just initial curiosity
Yeah.
on Tumblr in 2016 or like what was
Well,
it?
I was talking to my wife
Ah,
and we were just
yes.
like chatting back and forth on, like Messenger. We were on Instagram.
Very cute,
Yeah,
very
very cute.
gay.
And we were talking, this is less cute, but very gay. We were talking about the AIDS epidemic.
Okay,
And
yeah.
one of the things I brought up, I was like, yeah, lesbians were a huge part of like nursing gay men. And like, I was really talking about the role of lesbians. And my wife was like, I've never heard this before. And I
Mm-hmm.
was just crestfallen. I felt devastated about that. I was like, why wasn't the story told?
Mm-hmm.
Why wasn't the story encouraged to be known? And I got this fire and I started doing research. And on my birthday on 2015, I had Audacity and a laptop.
We're the same. Queer in Alberta started on like my 24th
Oh
birthday
my
or something as
God.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, but the youth, we're out here on our laptops
Yeah, we
being
have
like,
too much free time. Yeah.
exactly. And I was like, I'm gonna write an article about Sappho.
Mm.
And I wrote an article about Sappho and I posted it on tumblr.com. And it just started from there. I was, on the ground hustling. I was messaging every single person
Yeah.
who, I knew, being like, I'm talking about queer history. Be there or be square.
Calling out to community. No,
Exactly.
I think that's so cool.
Mhm.
And like you're totally right in that aspect about the AIDS epidemic
Yeah.
and the way that like lesbians came through for community and were
Mhm.
able to like do really important and vital work caring for community in ways that nobody else was. Like
Exactly.
even myself, I only learned about that maybe in the last 2 to 3 years. And I've seen it come to the forward of like
Mhm.
conversation more. And it's great. It's really important that we know our history.
100%. And I think that the more we know our history, the more we see a precedent for the conversations and the pain that we're going through now. Because I think a lot of people will look at queerness, and a lot of people are looking at queerness right now and seeing it come to the forefront, and they're being like, this is new. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
no,
Diva, we've been
we've
here
been
for a very
here
long
and we've been
time.
doing it this way. Like,
Mhm.
it's not that like the way we're talking about it is new and like random and just like a fad. It's something gorgeous that has a deep, rich history of just love and appreciation and time and community.
Mm.
And I couldn't love the queer community more for that.
Oh my goodness, Harper-Hugo, are you gonna make me cry in the first like 10 minutes of our episode and time together?
Yes.
I relate 100% to what
Yeah.
you're saying there. And I think that segues really well into like our main topic about
Yes.
history today. But before we go there, I
Mhm.
want to give the audience an opportunity to get to know you a bit more very
Okay.
quickly.
Yeah.
Because when we were first brainstorming our episode, you told me the absolute sweetest story
Yes.
about you and your wife, Will,
Yeah.
here in Lethbridge.
Yeah.
Like, as if Lethbridge would have such a hand in your love story. I feel like the audience needs to know this story of Bread, Milk, and Honey.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's one of my favorite stories.
Mhm.
So me and Will had just met in person for the first time. Will's my wife.
Mhm.
We had just met in person for the first time because my wife is from Norway and took a huge risk coming all the way to Canada to meet me.
To Lethbridge.
To Lethbridge.
Norway to Lethbridge. Like, Will
Mhm.
was brave.
Will was
brave.
brave. So impressed.
This is like The Notebook, but like for lesbians. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. And we met and we were so excited to see each other, so excited to meet each other, but we were still so timid about being visibly queer.
Mm.
And I know what Southern Alberta's reputation has in it, and I know my experiences with that, and I've had positive and negative experiences, but I've never been openly queer in public
Mhm.
before. So me and Will are like, okay, we're gonna go on our first
We're
date.
gonna do it. We're gonna do
We're
it.
gonna do it. We're gonna go on our first date to Bread, Milk, and Honey.
Which, to be fair, is like the fruitiest
Oh, yeah,
cafe in
100%.
Lethbridge.
100%. But I didn't know that yet. Like, there was no rainbow sticker on the door yet.
Before. These are the
rainbow
before
sticker.
times.
And so we go in and we sit across from each other and we are so in love. We're holding hands
Shut
across the
up.
table.
I'm blushing.
We're
I'm
holding hands.
blushing.
And we're just like trying to be subtle, but we can't because we're just in love and we're young.
Mm-hmm.
And we're sitting giggling to each other, talking, and we're about to leave. And one of the baristas comes up to us. And there's like a moment of panic. I was like, oh no, okay, it's going to be something.
Mm-hmm.
And this person walks up to us and they hand us a little bag with cookies in it.
Okay.
And I look at it, and on the bag it says, "We heart cute queers."
Again, I've had a day. I'm gonna start crying. Continue.
Like, come get a free drink,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll give it to you, like, whenever. And I was just, we have that bag framed in our apartment.
This is the gayest shit I've ever heard. Bleep.
And it's so funny because I this is like an extension of the story I didn't tell you about, but I was like, oh, this is such a great thing to have happened. What a cute story. So I posted it on Tumblr. And someone that I follow was like, "Bread milk and honey from Lethbridge?"
From Lethbridge.
From Lethbridge. And I'm like, yeah. They're like, "I'm from Lethbridge. Do you want to meet up?" And like, I
Shut
met
up.
this queer, amazing, cool, like non-binary person who was just so cool. And like the first, like, I'm trying to say not gender fuckery, but like gender fuckery person that I had met. And I just got to experience, queer community again just because of bread milk and honey.
That's insane. So I feel like if Bread Milk and Honey does not sponsor you in some way, or at least give you free coffee for
Yes,
forever,
for forever.
we just have to say thank you for them being such an amazing part of your love story.
100%. And I have told so many people in Edmonton, so I'm sure that they're coming down here to Lethbridge to
Yes.
get their coffee.
And like, it's totally crazy that you're saying you connected with this other queer person
Yeah.
in Lethbridge. Like, I so get that look of like, oh, you're doing this show in Lethbridge? Like, that's so random. But then you hear stuff like this. Like, it's a totally different picture of this area that I think so many people miss out on.
100%. And I just really view Lethbridge with so much love and so much
Tourism
tenderness.
Lethbridge needs to contact you.
Exactly.
Honestly.
Exactly. When are they going to get my number?
Uh-huh.
Because I just got to experience such a beautiful side of it. I got to experience so many people who were out and queer and doing the most bad stuff.
Right.
And I'm so, so grateful for that because it was my first experience with queer community and they gave me such tenderness. And not everyone gets that, especially not in Southern Alberta. But they did. And that is something I could not be more thankful for.
You're such a genuine speaker. Like,
Oh,
I can
thank you.
feel your passion and authenticity when you share these experiences. And
Thank
it
you.
really makes me reflect again on like how for me, Lethbridge was very much the same. Like that safe place to discover this part of my identity, to explore what does it mean for me to be queer? What does that look like?
Yeah.
So I just am having warm fuzzies
Oh, me
relating
too.
to you in that way. And now I think like, how am I even going to segue into the larger conversation? Because it's so just like, love. But I think we should try and move into the larger conversation. And so with your amazing historian like work that you do and your research, we wanted to focus on talking about somebody that had an Alberta connection for today's episode. And you brought up someone named Everett Klippert, who I had never heard of. But why did you bring up Everett Klippert today?
Well, first because I love him.
Uh-huh.
Because he's my best friend. No, I don't know.
He's my best friend.
He's my best friend.
Uh-huh.
No. I brought him up because he is a story that like really connects with me, and he's a story that I've shared in Edmonton, specifically at a couple of university talks, and I've seen how his story can like recontextualize some things for people because I think especially in Canada there's so much focus on American history.
Yes, we know Stonewall, Marsha
Yes.
P. Johnson, Stormy is Stormy. I can't remember her name.
Stormy D. Ooh, shoot.
Stormy, but also an amazing lesbian
amazing.
drag king who was
Yes.
involved. Yes.
And I think people forget that Canada has its own things going on at the same time. The same year, actually, that Stonewall happened, Canada legalized or decriminalized homosexuality.
I didn't realize that
Yeah.
actually. You're so right.
Yeah,
That's
1969.
incredible. And that what you're speaking to, the decriminalization of homosexuality, part of why you brought up Everett Klippert is because if I'm reading right, He was the last person in Canada to be convicted and charged with gross indecency,
Yes.
which, for maybe people that hear that term and don't understand it, can you perhaps expand on what gross indecency is?
Well, for this specific case, it
Yes.
means that he had sex with men.
Yes.
Like, just
Homosexual activity.
very frankly, he was
Mm-hmm.
having sexual relationships with men.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what makes Everett Klippert is such an interesting story is that he would not shut up about it.
This I
He
did not see on Wikipedia.
Yeah, he would not
Okay.
shut up about it. One of the lawyers who have like really studied the case, they were like, we could not put a hand over his mouth to make him stop talking about how he had sex with men.
I
He
mean,
was gonna
me,
say
but
it. Yeah. He was gonna say something, and
uh-huh.
he was just so honest. And as someone who like really values honesty and sees how brave that was to at the time
Mm.
just be like, yeah,
Here it is.
yeah,
These are the
here's what it is.
facts.
To say that in a country where it was criminalized at the time, to say that
Yes.
to police officers, to say that to people who are interrogating you, that's just incredible. That
No,
is
that
just
bravery.
incredible.
Yes. And before we get too far,
Mhm.
I want to start maybe with the beginning of
Mhm.
Everett's story. So, part of why we wanted to talk about him was he was born in
Yeah.
Saskatchewan, but grew up in Calgary.
Yes, he grew up in Calgary. He moved
Okay.
to Calgary when he was 2.
Okay.
So he was an Alberta boy.
Mm-hmm.
He was lucky enough to have a big family. His sister Leah, I'm going to mention her a couple times because she was an amazing person in his life, and I just really want to
Mm.
show that he had a really loving family. I
Mm-hmm.
really, if you take anything from his story, just take away the fact that he was loved.
Yeah.
He grew up in Calgary. He had a couple different jobs, but he ended up working as a bus driver for a time. And he is sort of well known for that part of his life because people just loved driving the bus with him because he would point out little different things and he was really
Cute.
chatty. And people would literally watch as other bus passed and like make sure they were on his bus because they were
He
like,
was the bus,
he
the
was the
one
bus
that
to
you
be on. It
wanted.
was popping off on his bus. And he was just really loved in his community. And eventually, because he was very honest about his life, the police were like, oh, no.
Because, yeah,
And
like you were saying, at this time, it's illegal to be gay. And do you know what year exactly this would be? Like at this point in the story?
at this point in the story, it would, I'd have to do a little bit of math to know the exact year. I'm sorry.
I feel you though. I
Yeah.
am not a math gay. Yeah, that would
Yeah.
be my partner, and she's not here right now. So,
So it would be early 60s.
okay. So
Early 60s.
you can set the scene
Yeah.
even just with that about what
Exactly.
social attitudes might be like towards queer people in Alberta.
Exactly. And specifically, one of the things that a lot of queer people were experiencing at the time was harassment from the police and
Mhm.
a lot of targeting from the police. Beyond the fact that queer acts were illegal in many cases, there was an attitude of if something was done, queer people probably did it because
Like anything.
Yeah, anything.
Really?
And that's going to come up again later in the story.
Mhm.
And if you're seen as a queer person, you're seen as someone who breaks rules, which, to be fair,
We don't
you
like
were
conformity.
we don't like conformity.
Mhm. But we're
We were-
also not like arsonists
we're
or
not
whatever.
arsonists.
Yeah.
And like it was very much seen at the time. There was this whole backdrop of queer people being fired from government jobs because it's like if you're queer, you're a liar.
Yeah.
So we need to get you out of here because you could, government security and stuff. And it was very ridiculous. That's a whole other aspect of Canadian queer history that
So
is
wild to think about because it's not that long ago
not that long ago
either.
at all. And he would definitely be experiencing a lot of crackdowns from like the people around him, and specifically the police were like a big part of the sort of culture of fear there because they were keeping an eye on the queer community. They were
Yeah.
definitely keeping an eye on the queer community, and that was not a kind eye. And with him, again, I want to really stress that he was loved. He was adored. He had employers who were like, no, he was a great guy. Don't worry about it. But the police came in and they were like, hey,
He's just minding his
He's just
business,
minding his
living his
business.
life.
He's
Is he
having
still in
some
Calgary at this point?
Yeah, he's still in
Yeah,
Calgary.
yeah, yeah.
He's having a good time, and he's, sleeping with men because he deserves to. Treat yourself.
Yeah, we're here to speak to it.
We're
Yeah,
here to
yeah,
speak
yeah.
to it. He's having sex with men, and the police bring him in, and they're like, "Are you having sex with men?" And he's like, "Yes."
Okay.
Do you want a list?
Oh my
They're like, "Oh,
gosh.
good lord." Okay.
Do you know
And
how old he is at this point?
he would be
Because I'm like,
yeah.
that is a bold 23-year-old. That's
No,
what
no,
I'm
he was like
envisioning.
30s. He was 30s.
Okay,
He was in his 30s,
okay.
which is still very, almost even more bold to me because,
Yeah.
when you're young, you don't understand the consequences as much.
Mhm.
But he had a life. He had a life. He had a job. He had a family. He had a family who was very Christian as well. So he was taking, well, not a risk even. He was just being honest. He was just being frank. A lot of his lawyers said he just expected things to work out if he was honest and kind. And I'm
Mhm.
like, it should have. It should have worked out because he was honest and kind. Because what else could you ask from a person? But at the time, they asked a lot more. And what they asked was, okay, who are you sleeping with? And he wrote down a list, and 18 names.
Okay.
Yeah, he was around. He was having a good time. And they put him in prison for 4 years. And he loved his family, and he was so worried about bringing shame to them.
Right.
So he moved. He left. He left Calgary. He went to the Northwest Territories, and the police in Calgary called up the police in the Northwest Territories, and they're like, "Hey, gay coming your way."
No, no. No,
Mhm.
no.
Yeah, gay coming your way. Keep an eye out for him.
This is unbelievable. So,
Mhm.
like, they literally brought him in for just like an ambiguous random thing. Like,
Mhm.
what was the main reason before?
I think for him, for like this charge, they were like, "You're gay.
Okay.
Let's talk
So
about
they
it."
just like knew in the
Mhm.
community
Mhm.
kind of like this almost surveillance aspect and
100%.
cracking down on suspected queer people.
Exactly.
That's terrifying.
It's terrifying. And, another person and another people probably did end up in that situation. And to
Mhm.
protect themselves, they were like, "I've never slept with a man in my life. What are you
Right.
talking about?" And no judgment on that choice at all.
Yeah.
But what an interesting thing that he was like,
This is who
"No,
I am.
this is who I am. This is it."
And unafraid.
Unafraid. And I can just not admire him more for that.
Wow.
It's
I
so
don't
he
know if I
goes,
could do the same thing. Do you know what I mean? Like being in
I
such a threatening environment, I'd want to say that yes. And like in a day of social media, I don't think I have much of a choice. You go on my
Yeah.
Instagram, it speaks for me, right? But all levity aside, it's a really interesting choice because what do you do? Do you protect yourself, your family, or be honest? Like I couldn't imagine what it's like to be faced with something like that.
100%. And it's almost like a Kant level of honesty, like of a,
Mm.
you're going to do what you're going to do,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm going to be standing in my honesty no matter what choices you make. And that, is so powerful to me. That is so almost a scary level of honesty.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
you're like, wow, how do you manage like that?
And I think when you were talking about how
Mhm.
knowing your history shows you what we've been through before,
Yeah.
I've always thought that like when you hear these stories, you hear about the resiliency and strength that people in our community had before us. And
Mhm.
especially now that we're facing change and fear
Yes.
and discrimination as queer people across the world, it feels like
Mhm.
to know that not even that far behind, like a generation or
Mhm.
two at
Yeah.
most, this story of like just bravery and strength is
Yes.
happening. You can draw from that just by
Mhm.
knowing it.
100%. And one thing that I really want to like put in people's minds while we're like exploring the story
Mm-hmm.
is that this man was not an activist. This man was
Mm-hmm.
not
He was a
someone.
bus driver
He was a
who was
bus
there for a good
driver. He
time.
was there for a good time. He liked sleeping with men, and that was like
Mm-hmm.
he liked driving the bus and sleeping with men. Go off, king. But
Uh-huh.
he wasn't an activist later in his life because of a lot of the events that we're about to explore. He would be contacted by pride organizations being like, "Do you want to talk about this?" And he's like, "No, I just want to live my life." And I think
Mm-hmm.
something that when looking at queer history, people sort of expect to see is this legacy of like people fighting the man, which
Right.
we love fighting the man. But there's also this legacy of people who just lived their lives honestly
And just want to be.
just want to be, and through that change the world.
Mm-hmm.
Like just by through living who they were, changed everything around them.
Well, I think that's very much Everett's case, right?
100%.
Because like as we're talking through this story, you said that he was he in prison for 4 years before
4
going to
years.
the Northwest
Yeah.
Territories? And then this happens all over again.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have him at the Northwest Territories. He gets a job, and then there's an arson. And the police are like, okay. And
Just
there's
like
an
in the
interview.
community.
Yeah, there's an
Yeah.
arson. And they're like, okay, arsonists are deviants and homosexuals are
Deviants.
deviants.
1 + 1 is 2.
1 + 1 is 2.
Everett
Bring him in.
Klippert. Yeah.
Let's bring him in. So they sit him down, and he's like, I didn't commit the arson, but I have slept with some men. And they're like, okay, let's talk about it.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
do you know if they like, because for me, when I first like was looking at this story and saw the arson bit and then how it immediately segues to another conviction for gross indecency, I'm like, that seems so suspicious. You're telling me you're bringing him in for this really like, okay, random crime, and somehow you wind up with he's gay.
Yeah. How did we get there? How did we get there?
Yeah.
Well, those things are absolutely connected. Like,
Mhm.
it was not a situation where
Too
they were not-
coincidental.
Exactly. They were bringing him in because he was gay.
Yeah.
That's frankly it. They got a call from Calgary. The person who did it, who brought him in and like was a part of his conviction, was very frank in an interview and was like, he's a deviant in this way. He's going to be a deviant in this way. We're
Mhm.
bringing him in. And, the questioning ended up being around his queerness, and he ended up getting a life sentence, which,
I'm just like
what?
sitting with that.
Yeah.
A life sentence for I was brought in about
Mhm.
arson, and
Yeah.
then it became about my private life with
Yeah.
other consenting adults,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah. And he, he went through the process of being convicted, just being honest, just being frank, just being real with these people, being like, yeah, I'm going to continue sleeping with men. And he ended up getting a life sentence because more or less legally what they were looking at, and he was categorized as a dangerous sexual offender. And the psychiatrists who were involved in that, psychologists who were involved in that, were like, okay, well, it depends on how you define that legally, because does dangerous sexual offender mean that he's attacking people? He's never going to attack someone. We to our ability to know this, he's never done anything like that. Does it mean that he's going for people underage? No, that's not happening. But does it mean that he's going to do it again? Yes. And that was the legal question, because it did get brought up in higher courts because his sister, Leah, was working in a law office at the time, and she
Right.
was fighting for her brother. She was fighting to get her brother out of jail. And going to these bigger courts, the question ended up being, okay, well, does he count as a dangerous sexual offender if we know he's not going to hurt anybody, if we know he's going to go only after, if we know that he is only interested in other consenting adults? Because like the psychologist literally said, they were like, he's only interested in people who are interested in him. He's only ever gone after people who are interested in him. The legal question ended up being, and the psychologist had to say in the end, yes, he's going to be gay again. And Everett was very frank. He was like, I have no interest in having sex with women. I have as much interest in having sex with women as a heterosexual male has in having sex with men. It does not interest me at all. And he was just like, yeah, I'm going to recommit. I'm going to be gay again.
I'm going to do it again.
I'm going to do it again.
This is incredible. I'm like, how did he have so much confidence almost, it seems, to just be like, no, this is who I am. This is like, to know that he wasn't doing anything wrong while literally the face of the legal system is ensnaring him and telling him something is wrong and putting real, very real ramifications on his life and well-being.
And like in a society at the time where homosexuality was seen as a disease, to just be like, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to live my life. What an incredible incredible bravery that must have taken.
And almost like, no disrespect, whatever, almost delusion. Do you
Oh
know
yeah,
what I mean? Where I'm
100%.
sitting here and
All
I'm
of his
like,
lawyers were like, "What are you doing?
yeah, like,
Just say you're not going to do it and then do it." And he's like, "No."
but such a commitment to like, I'm
Mhm.
not going to compromise
Mhm.
my authenticity and my
100%.
identity. Like in this specific time frame as well,
Yeah.
it's really something to hear about.
100%. And everyone, when looking at his story, is in some way just like almost enchanted by that. Like, how
Mm-hmm.
can you not look at that and be
Mystified.
like, yeah, even the people who are against him are like, what are you doing?
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah,
how did we end
yeah.
up here? And yeah, no, he did not really, he didn't want to make a fuss. He wasn't like out there, on the streets. He wasn't doing activism, but he wasn't, when asked a question, he wasn't going to lie to you. He was going to tell
Mm-hmm.
you the truth as plainly as he could.
That's incredible.
That's incredible.
And I want to ask you too, because
Mhm.
you were mentioning his sister Leah
Yeah.
from the legal perspective.
Yeah.
I didn't realize she was like so involved
Yeah.
in his plight and story. But I think what I read, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is that they took this appeal essentially to dismiss the charge or whatever, both to, I think, provincial
Yeah.
court and the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And both times it was denied.
Yeah.
And dismissed, even though the Supreme Court ruling was very tight and
Yes.
controversial.
Yes,
So
it
that,
was
yeah.
2-3.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, the vote was 2-3, and people were upset. They did not like that ruling at all.
This is what I wanted to ask you. So
Yeah.
when you say they were upset, was it they were in favor of Everett or against?
They were in favor of Everett.
That's what I
They're-
wanted to know, because I'm like, how is the public
the
responding to
public?
this at this point?
And I don't want to generalize. There were definitely people out there who was like, put him in jail forever. But, a couple years before, England had decriminalized homosexuality.
Yeah, yeah.
The USA had decriminalized homosexuality. What's Canada doing? Canada
Mhm.
hates being seen as regressive. We hate it.
Interesting.
And so people saw this, and one of the words that was used often was draconian. Like, they were like, this is so
Wow.
regressive. This is so backwards. What are we doing?
And can I just pause?
Yeah.
That is called draconian.
Yeah.
And look at what is happening across Canada
Currently.
today, right?
Mhm.
Like, what's going on? What's going on?
One of the things about history is that it's not a straight line upwards. It unfortunately, it would be great if it was, but yeah, it's wiggly. Linear progress does not exist in our world right now.
Mhm, mhm.
And he just, because he was denied by the provincial courts, but because he was denied by the Supreme Court, there was only one option left,
Mhm.
which was to change the law.
Yes.
And that was what people took on. Two of the biggest voices in that were Tommy Douglas and Pierre Trudeau.
Which these are figures that even us being younger, we know who
We
those
know
people
those
are,
people
right?
are.
Which again, I think contextualizes it
Mhm.
and showing how it is very much close history, not far away history. And I thought it was so fascinating how, I know you'll expand on this, but even though it seems in my read of it, Tommy Douglas kind of entering the picture and standing up for Everett is like, pro-gay rights,
Yeah.
because of the time frame, still having to be careful about how you use the
100%.
language to support this person in
100%.
court. Mhm.
And I don't want to get too into the weeds, but like
Yeah.
what you're specifically referring to was him being like, this man has a disease.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep. Not like a
Because-
criminal whatever, but more so I think it was a psychiatric
Mhm.
problem is how they framed it.
Exactly. And what is interesting is that like that was a very progressive idea at the time because
Mhm.
again, not to get too into the weeds, this idea was popularized in Germany
Of like a mental disease?
of it being a mental disease
Okay.
from a name that people who love queer history might recognize, Magnus Hirschfeld.
Okay, I don't know Magnus.
Magnus was, if you want to do research into some incredible
Let
queer
me write that
history,
down.
exactly.
Yeah.
Magnus Hirschfeld is a great, great name because he really fought pre-World War II. He was a gay Jewish man in Germany, and people were not a fan of that. But he created one of the biggest collections, well, the biggest at the time, collections of queer scientific research because his motto was through science to justice, because he thought that if we just studied it, if we just looked at queerness, we would understand that it was something innate, that was something that was a part of people.
Yeah.
And that was a very new ideology at the time. It was very new to say that queerness was not an action, but it was a way a person was.
Mm-hmm.
Someone was queer. They didn't just do queer things.
Mm-hmm.
So that was like a very new idea at the time, and he really popularized it. Like it didn't start with him, but he popularized it. And
So Magnus is an ally.
Magnus
Magnus is
he was
the
gay.
ally. Yeah,
He
yeah,
was
yeah.
gay. So like he wasn't just an ally, he was a part of us.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And he was I could talk about him for hours, but we'll
Mhm.
get back to our guy.
Yes.
We'll get back to Everett. Because Tommy Douglas, we can see the line that led Tommy Douglas to exactly what he said. And it comes from Germany, and it comes from the idea of like queerness as an identity rather than just as an action. And the law was punishing it as an action rather than viewing it as an identity. And disease and identity were like sort of the transitionary points. It was like disease, identity. So we can definitely
Baby steps.
baby steps. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's a perfect way of putting it. And Tommy Douglas was like, this man has a disease. Why are we putting him in jail for life? That makes no sense.
Mm-hmm.
And Pierre Trudeau became interested in this case before he actually was prime minister.
Right. Yeah.
And he campaigned partially on this case because he's like, okay, we all agree this is ridiculous, right?
Mhm.
So he campaigned partially on decriminalizing homosexuality because, as he said, and this is a very famous quote for Canadians,
Right.
the government has no place in our bedrooms.
In the bedroom. In
Exactly.
the bedroom. Tell me why I heard about that in middle school. You're bringing so many memories back to
Yeah.
the forefront.
And in 1969, he did it.
It's bringing the laws of the land up to contemporary society, I think. Take this thing on homosexuality. I think the view we take here is that there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation, and I think that what's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code.
He successfully decriminalized homosexuality in Canada.
Exactly. Bill C-150.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the exact same time as the Stonewall riots were happening.
Everything's connected.
Everything's
Everything is connected.
And in Canada, if you find newspapers from the time, you're not going to find any mention of Stonewall, because what does that mean? Like, we didn't know that it was something that was going to change the world.
Mm-hmm.
What we knew was Everett.
Right.
We knew that Everett needed to get out of jail.
So how long has he been in prison at this point?
He's been in prison 3 or 4 years.
Okay, yeah.
So he's been in prison for like a good amount of time, and then he remains in prison for 3 years after it's decriminalized, and no one can figure out why.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. I'm like, if the charge is dismissed and no longer illegal, why is he still serving?
Well, I just want to like bring a little touch of intersectionality into this conversation and say there are some things that are currently not illegal in Canada that people are
Yes,
still in
you're
prison for.
absolutely right.
So this is something that I like to bring forward in this discussion. We know it's not wrong. We've agreed as a country certain things are no longer wrong.
And yet
there are still people in prison for it. What a weird thing that we could change really easily.
I think you're campaigning.
Yeah, I'm campaigning.
Harper-Hugo for prime minister.
Yeah, winner.
Yeah, Lethbridge. It's gayer than you think.
Exactly. But specifically with Everett, this case,
yes,
there's been a lot of theorizing as to why he didn't leave jail. And the sort of prevailing thought, and also the funniest thought, was that he just didn't bring it up. He was just like a very head down, do my thing kind of guy.
Okay.
And he just didn't ask to be let go. So he just remained in
So he
jail
just
for 3
chilled.
extra years. And that's hilarious to me. And it does fit his personality very well.
That he was just like, head down.
Yeah.
I'm going to be fine.
I'm going to be fine. We're going to figure it out. And then like 3 years later, they're like, wait,
Hold
you're not
on.
supposed to be
Bestie.
here.
Yeah.
You like literally changed the shape of this country.
100%.
Why are you still in jail?
No, that's wild. And like immediately Harper-Hugo, I'm
Mhm.
like, did anyone, because you've mentioned he's private,
Yeah.
right? Even though very public in
Yeah.
his fight for, in his own way, equality and
Yeah.
the right to be respected in his
Mhm.
private life and relationships. But did he ever give like interviews with anybody about this experience? Like, is that where you're getting some of your research from? I'm
Some of
just
my
curious.
research is he didn't do interviews that I've found. Like my
Yeah.
knowledge isn't perfect,
Mm-hmm.
but I will say that like most of what we know is from his psychiatrist, his lawyers,
Got it.
and not so much like interviews from news stations. So
Mm-hmm.
what we know is definitely from like the people who he had to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
So, because he was like a more private man, when he got out of jail, he moved to Edmonton and became a truck driver and just sort of lived the rest of his life around his family.
Peacefully.
Peacefully. He ended up getting married to a woman, which is a big surprise,
Okay.
big twist in the story.
Okay.
They were friends and they just wanted to be companions.
Okay.
And the woman was named Dorothy, and they lived together until his death. And his family is the reason he's remembered
This
as
is
like
so
thoroughly as he has.
incredible.
And if you ask anyone in his family, they will tell you he was just a kind, loving man who
Mm-hmm.
cared so much about them. What a great way to be remembered.
A beautiful way to be remembered, and how fascinating that I think his story already is like not nearly as well known as it should
Yeah.
be, but B, like that he was almost at peace with that. Like
Yeah.
he wasn't seeking to perhaps be the phenomena of change that he was, but his story in effect gave you and I the rights that we have
Exactly.
today, and so many people from our community.
Exactly. Just by being honest, being kind,
Mm-hmm.
and having people who loved him, he changed the world in a way. And
Mm-hmm.
that is something that I just could not be more in awe of.
Mm-hmm.
What a affirmation that we're doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
That we can change the world by just existing
And just
in
speaking up and
just speaking up and just
advocating.
being who we are.
Yeah, he wasn't an activist, but
Mm-mm.
just by living boldly and
Exactly.
defiantly, he kind of became one in some ways.
And like I would honestly say Leo was more of an activist than he was.
Yeah, his
The
sister.
people who loved him were becoming activists on his behalf.
Mm-hmm.
The people who were in his life wanted to protect him and wanted to save him from being in jail for the rest of his life, because that's
Mm-hmm.
ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we have the rights we have today, is because people loved a man who was kind and honest.
Mm-hmm. And I'm still kind of reeling though over the Una reverse of
Yeah.
him marrying a woman,
Yeah.
bisexual, pansexual king,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
whatever. But no, it's just an amazing, amazing story. And again, like my own father is born in 1962. Like within the context of this
Yeah.
story, it's not that long ago, as
It is
we've
not.
said many, many times throughout our conversation today.
Mhm.
But what do you think, like looking at this man's story, what does his story teach us?
Mhm. I think in a big way it teaches us that honesty and love are really the root of change. And I
love that.
think that that's like a really complicated thing within the queer community, because I will never ever judge someone for having to lie to protect themselves. I'll never do that. But I will be amazed by the people who have chosen bravely to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
I will always be amazed by that. And even, we say it was, history, but even now it's painful to be that honest. It's hard to be that honest. It's incredible to be that honest.
I so agree. And I'm thinking about how, like, even in Edmonton, where
Yeah.
you're from, like, there's the Edmonton Queer History Project.
Yes, they're
And
incredible.
isn't it incredible to
Yeah.
see these quote unquote alternative histories and
Yeah.
experiences of what it means to be an Albertan? Like, in addition to Everett's story, which is the whole reason that homosexuality has been decriminalized in Canada, was it Delwind Green? I might be getting his name wrong, but he was a professor in Edmonton who was fired for being gay and then took it to the Supreme Court, and
Yeah.
then it became illegal to be fired from your workplace based on sexual orientation. As well as, I think the Edmonton Queer History Project recently had a story about a teenager in, like, again, similar time frame, 60s or 70s, who wanted to, like, talk about in his high school graduation photo or something, finding
Oh,
a big, like,
yes.
strong gay man,
Yeah.
and like his fight to be able to say that.
Mhm.
I think it's so interesting that we have so many people doing that kind of like explosive, breaking boundaries work just by being openly authentic, but then go out quietly, these stories like fade away and they're not, I don't know, it's fascinating to me.
And like one thing that I think is just like so interesting about these stories and so relevant about these stories is that like they're the stories of people who just had an understanding of themselves and an understanding of the world that was within a time that didn't want them. You know, they existed within a time that did want to punish them, that did want them to be quiet, that did want them to be dismissed as much as possible. This was a time where it was safest and most encouraged to shut up and be as far away from the limelight as you can. And they just said no. They just simply said no. And through that, they made history.
Through that, they made history. I love it.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Harper-Hugo, for telling me this story. And like, even just as another queer person, I
Yeah.
think hearing queer history, period, is like such a revelation. but to
100%.
hear locally specific queer history from people that have been facing the same challenges or have loved the same landscapes and homes that I have here in Alberta, there's something truly, truly special about that. So thank you for sharing with me and my
Thank you.
audience.
And I just want to like bring like a final note to that
Yes.
and say that when I was doing the research on him, one of the facts that I found was that his remains are in this tiny, tiny town called Castor,
Okay. Yeah.
under 1,000 people.
Mhm.
And I was just thinking about how there's going to be a queer person listening to this podcast thinking their small town has no connection to queer history. There's going to be a person who's like, I have under 1,000 people in my town. What do you mean?
Right.
What do you mean we have a deep, important connection to queer history? But they do. So if you're from Castor, Alberta, shout out.
Shout out. Go leave Everett some flowers.
Exactly.
I
He's
love-
there. There's nothing that we do that is not interconnected with queer history.
Well, it even brings us back to the beginning, right? Where you were
Exactly.
talking about there was another queer person in your home community that you grew
Yes.
up in that you had no idea about. And I
Mhm.
think like you doing the work that you do to map out those connections on both a local and far larger scale through
Yeah.
making queer history, it is so important. And I just applaud you for everything that you do love.
Thank you. And I am so grateful that you are doing the work locally.
Ah,
I'm so grateful.
Stop. Okay. I'm going to turn red again. Well, I learned so much today about Everett Klippert, and I feel like this is just the beginning of a deep
Yeah.
dive on Albertans and queer Albertans. You are welcome back on the show whenever you want.
Thank you.
And I can see that Hazel has fallen head over heels in love with you over there.
Me too. I love her.
She might be going back with you to make queer
Yeah,
history.
check our bags before
Yeah.
we leave.
Awesome. Well, do you want to maybe look into this camera over here and just share a little bit about where folks can follow along with all of the amazing work that you do?
Well, our hub is our website, www.makingqueerhistory.com. You can find everything about us there. You can also find us on social media. We're on Instagram. We're on Tumblr still.
No way.
We're on Tumblr. We're
Only real
not
ones
on X
know.
because no, thank
X.
you.
Mhm.
We've X'd it out. And we're on Pinterest if you're interested in queer history from Pinterest. And yeah, you can find all of our stuff through our website. That's the best place if you're curious about anything. And we have over 200 articles. I have written over 200 articles, so
they are
please read some of them.
busy.
Yeah,
Booked and
exactly.
busy. Well, everybody, make sure you go and follow along with Making Queer History. I am so happy that we had them here on the show, as well as let's give a shout out to Will in the corner back there. Supportive bestie, supportive wife. Could not have made it happen without the both of you today. We'll see you next time on Queer in Alberta. Bye. Coming up next on Queer in Alberta. But in the pursuit of good journalism, I have to ask, you brought up this Brokeback Mountain truck, but the film was filmed in 2005. Were either of you living in Fort Macleod at the time? And did you get to be an extra with Jake Gyllenhaal and Heath Ledger in the gayest cowboy love story the Prairies has ever seen?
Okay, no, but I do have two good Brokeback stories.
Yes!
Okay,
This
this
is
is
what I'm
PG.
fishing for.